Abby Uriarte is a consumer marketing, business, and strategy consultant focused on driving revenue and growth for cannabis businesses. Maggie Connors is the founder and CEO of Besito, a cannabis products company based in LA. Previously, she worked in brand management at Pepsi, Starbucks, and Apple. And Michael Jensen is a Los Angeles-based cannabis attorney. His focus is obtaining local land use entitlements and state permits to engage in commercial cannabis activity under California's Medicinal and Adult Use Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act.
So today we have a panelist here, and I'm very excited to have the panelist, partly because I was introduced to Abby through a good friend of mine. We used to work together, and she worked in the cannabis space and brought on Maggie and Michael as well. So the special thing about today is, one, they are on the East. Well, we have a mutual relationship with a friend there, and then one, they're on the. And the other thing is that they're on the West Coast. So a lot of their experience today has been primarily around LA and California, and just certainly happy to have them here today. So Abby, Maggie, and Michael, thank you for joining us. Why don't you guys tell us a little bit about yourself? We'll start with Abby, and as I mentioned before, definitely feel free to just dive in and make it as present as possible how you got into the industry and past experience and things like that.
Sure. So I've been in the cannabis industry in LA for 3 years. I got into the space because I was looking to join a high growth industry, and I saw that the cannabis industry was about to explode. This was 2017 when I started looking into it. So when it was still medical market in California, I knew we were going to turn rec on Jan 1, 2018, and just seemed like the perfect time to jump in. I ended up joining a company called MedMen, which hopefully people on the East Coast have heard of too, but it's a large MSO. It was a really small operation when I joined. We brought them from medical into recreational through their IPO and into multi-state operations. I was a member of the marketing team there, so really growing the business from its infancy into being really well known. And prior to getting into cannabis, I had kind of a mix of traditional and startup background. I worked at American Express in marketing. I also worked at Beachbody in brand management. And I felt my experience in supplements there kind of translated well to cannabis. Currently, I consult for different cannabis businesses and brands, helping them with revenue generating activities, marketing, and business strategy.
Awesome. Thank you. We're happy to have you, Abby. Mm-hmm. Thanks again for making the connection. Why don't we go with Maggie next?
Of course.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maggie Connors, and I am the founder and CEO of a cannabis products company here in LA called Besito, which means little kiss in Spanish. We have a vaporizer on the market, and it's high in CBD and lighter in THC. And then we're also about to launch a new flower business on the pre-roll side, which I'm very excited about. I have been in the industry for 4 years. First, I was on the investment side in early 16. Very fascinating to kind of the whole journey has been fascinating, but the investment side kind of right before full rec, and then of course operating the last few years as the market transitioned from medical to the market we have today, which I know we'll talk about. And before that, I had been in consumer packaged goods at Pepsi and Starbucks on the East Coast in New York, where I'm from. And it took moving out to California for me and I went to business school. So I moved out to go to business school to realize that cannabis, which I've always loved, could be a career and not just like sort of a secret in my apartment in New York. And I got super inspired by seeing legalization in California on the horizon. I'm a brand and design and consumer insights geek, so I was very excited about the opportunity of bringing new aesthetic and kind of a point of view on cannabis that I wasn't seeing in a very kind of hardcore, masculine, very potent culture. And then I was also very inspired by kind of the leadership and management opportunity to help shape not a new industry. It's been existing for a long time, and a lot of activists have fought for decades to get us where we are today, but help shape a new legal industry fully in California and, of course, the nation, especially given the background of this plant and the criminalization and the harms that helping repair the harms caused by the war on drugs and bringing and building an equitable business with people of color is something that really has inspired me from the beginning. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. Great. Well, Michael?
Sure. Thanks, Ulysses, for having me. My name is Michael Jensen. I'm a California cannabis business attorney, I guess is what we're called these days. I have been in this space since 2015. I actually sort of fell backwards into cannabis when I was waiting for bar results, which is in California, a 3-month process. And a friend of mine was starting a cannabis company and wanted to know what, he had worked in the industry for years, but needed help writing a business plan. At the time, I was actually in business school. And so I wrote the business plan, and I had to get sort of a crash course in the California regulatory environment, which at that time was shifting from what we had, the Compassionate Use Act since 1996 and some other bills that allowed for medical, to a real robust program, and that eventually turned into what we now have, the adult use program in place. So I, turned out it was a expanding industry and an interesting one to work in on the legal side. So I've been doing that since 2015, and I've worked with startups and legacy operators, which are the folks that have been doing it on the quasi-legal side, under the old medical system. And I've also worked with private equity companies and the investment side on doing joint ventures. I do regulatory compliance and HR and land use entitlements and sort of everything that these businesses run into. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles. And yeah, that's my story.
That's great. I don't think I knew that you were an MBA as well. So you got your MBA and your JD?
I'm not unfinished degree.
Oh.
MJ dropped out.
Yeah.
I dropped out.
But the rest of
it was after law school. It was after law school, and I just didn't have it in me to do any more degrees.
You felt compelled to go to business school after law school?
Yeah, in retrospect, I probably should have done the joint program because I could have saved a year of it. But yeah, I took the important courses, finance, accounting, stuff that actually I do use today. Right. But a lot of the other courses I just felt were not worth it, at least after the nightmare of law school.
No, I feel you, man. Well, I appreciate you sharing and being transparent about that. So just, I don't think I actually knew either. So where are you from originally, Mike?
So I grew up in Pennsylvania. I've been in California for about, now it's more than 10 years. So I think I'm now a native Angelino, or Venetian, as we say.
All right. And that's, I know, Maggie, you've been there for 7 years. You had mentioned on email. And Abby, how about you at this point?
It has been 5 years since I moved to LA. So I actually have now lived here longer than I did in New York, which is crazy, but originally from Rhode Island.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that leads to the question of like what the cannabis market out there, the culture is very, very strong. especially compared to, maybe a PA or New York, Connecticut. We're all from the East Coast here. So just what's your take on, like, why the culture is so strong, and how does it differ from other markets, especially back home here in the East?
I mean, I think the biggest obvious difference is that we have a recreational market that's kind of been around longer than some of those other states. Some of the states you mentioned are still medical.
Right.
And California just has like the richest history when it comes to the cannabis industry. There are people who have been in the industry here for 25 years. And so there's this real like OG versus new feel to it. And so it's kind of this interesting dichotomy now where it's like you have these people who have been in it for years and years and years, and we're operating illegally and kind of like pave the way in many ways for these new companies to come through. So sometimes there's this kind of clash between like old and new, and like, new money coming in and white corporate weed and all of that. That's kind of can be looked down upon or as pushing out some of the mom and pop shops. But I think, it's just, we've had, even though we've only been recreational for 2.5 years, our medical market was like very loose. So it's been very prevalent just for a long time in California and very accepted.
Absolutely. Definitely OG. I like that.
Yeah.
MJ had brought up the fact that it's was it 96 or 97 for California. So do you see kind of any differences in regulations between the medical market and the adult market? Because I feel like, in California it's easy to get a card, and I was having this conversation with a friend the other day, where in Connecticut or New York, it's big. It's very difficult to get a card. Like, why is that? What's the difference there?
Oh, go ahead.
I know I was going to give a brief before we give it to the lawyer, but I think, as Abby touched on, California has been growing the best weed for generations, and just the culture out here, plus having the first medical market for 20 years that, as you said, was very kind of loose, and therefore, especially given the size of the state, it was a $3 billion industry. And
unregulated or medical? You mean?
The medical market in California, and I say meta quotes because, as you probably know, the sort of like conditions in California were a lot less stringent. Some might say not stringent at all, versus other medical programs we see. And so actually, California, unlike most other states, once we switched to fully rec, the market went down, because you had a very sort of sophisticated but loosely regulated market, and doors and folks and grows and systems and point of view on brands and products, such that then kind of squeezing that into a new set of laws and licenses, I think we've seen it set the market back a bit, the legal market back a bit, and we're still adjusting, I would say.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the California cannabis culture, I mean, it began, I think, probably in the 60s, if not earlier than that. And, the Emerald Triangle, which are 3 counties in Northern California, I'm sure at one point produced the majority of cannabis that was consumed in America. So I think that has in large part to like why California is such a monster in the marketplace. But in 1996, I mean, the bill authorizing medical cannabis was, I think, 2 sentences long. So that was the amount of regulation that existed. I mean, back then you were essentially using this, the Compassionate Use Act, as an affirmative defense to prosecution. What you were doing was still illegal. You could be arrested by your local sheriffs or police. You would then talk to the DA, and have this as an affirmative defense. So it was not an affirmative right to do something. It was, if you got caught, here's what you can lean your hat on, you can lean on to protect you. But that was not, people's risk tolerance for that kind of environment was such that it was just mom and pops and local growers who were willing to take that risk without having a real robust, and I can get into we could have a whole separate seminar on sort of the federal state balance of how they treat this. But that risk appetite is not for everyone. And so I think that's a big reason why the industry 20 years ago or 10 years ago was much different than probably it looks like now, even though I think cannabis is just as big a part of the culture in California. It's just, I think it's changed a little bit with, private equity and the types of investors that have come in to do it.
Great.
One more thing I'll just add between like the distinctions between medical and recreational here. So now the biggest distinction, and MJ, you can probably add more to this, but is I think in regards mostly to edibles, like the size of edibles. So now in the recreational market, edibles all have to be under 10 milligrams. And you have to have a medical license to sell anything over that. And you have to have a medical card. And it's not the old medical card where you'd go in and say, I have anxiety, give me a medical card. It's like it's like the MMJ card, I think it's called, or something. And
it's a county issued health card.
Yeah. And you actually get discounts on taxes when you use that card to buy medical products specifically.
Interesting. I want to go back to
like in a place like New York, you have to have one of, I believe it's 13 qualifying medical conditions.
Yeah.
So every state has different things, but it's, recreational consumption has been kind of like the biggest focus of the California market, I feel, since we switched over.
So one thing that Maggie had said was that
don't even carry medical products anymore, nor do they even care to secure a medical license.
So one thing is that, like, taking a step back, Maggie, you had mentioned like the system taking a step back in terms of once maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. I feel like Abby's talking on that a little bit as well.
And that's obviously just been, we kind of have 2 years under our belt now from 2018. But yeah, it went from about 3 billion to about 2.5 billion, I believe.
Oh, I got you now. Yep.
And it's because it was, versus that, I believe Colorado, Washington sort of with legalization as expected,
right,
flourished, grew bigger. We've had to adjust because I think, our medical market was like nobody else in size and process. And so now, everything being so highly regulated, waiting for state and munis to give out licenses, to even do business in a compliant way. Me and many folks, I'm sure, have just kind of been waiting, especially in 2018, a bit of 2019, for the licenses to be given out and everything to be compliant to the new regulations so that we can make and sell weed.
So it sounds like that the medical market, to Abby's point, is still kind of expanding now. I mean, it seems like there's incentive for some folks to still be a part of it, as it sounds. And I could say that's almost the same in Massachusetts, where they've reduced some of the fees. It's kind of expensive to have a medical card. So, for the folks that, find the benefit in that avenue, it definitely makes sense for them to go that route, just based on, taxation being different and things of that nature.
The other sort of big thing to mention as we talk about medical and rec and the markets changing is sort of the lack of reinforcement on the legacy market and now unregulated market in California. That market's huge. It's estimated that I think 90% of all cannabis transactions in 2019 were underground or whatnot, not the new laws. And so I think that's that's sort of representative of California's history, but also a big, of course, factor in where the legal industry is.
Yeah, there were some reports that the tax revenue was well short of, right? What are those? You know the numbers and the disparity that it fell short?
Well, in typical California fashion, they have decided to overtax and overregulate this industry. And I'm not a Republican or anything, but I'm definitely noticing. I mean, I put together these entitlement applications for people who want to start legal businesses. To start a legal grow in California, you need to interface with 7 different state agencies just for that one operation.
8?
And things from, I mean, there's the Department of Food and Agriculture, which is actually the licensing authority that does it. The Department of Fish and Wildlife. You need your local water board, the Regional Air Quality Board. Probably the Department of Health will visit you. I mean, there are just an endless list of bureaucratic agencies that you have to deal with, which is why a lot of when the transition from the medical only market that wasn't regulated to the adult use and medical market that was highly regulated, a lot of people just said, no thanks, I'm going to stick with the way I've been doing it for 20 years. And even though now the penalties for doing that, you no longer have that affirmative defense of under the Compassionate Use Act. It's just a lot of, I mean, this is why mom and pop shops get priced out. This is why social equity businesses get priced out. It's all related, and it's unfortunate because they've turned an opportunity, they've sort of squandered what an opportunity would be, just because there's just so many layers of regulation and taxes that, I mean, by the time a product gets to a consumer, it's taxed like 5 times. And that's just, there's no way to incentivize people to go legal when it's going to be more expensive and much more difficult to do. I mean, I have a job because it's so complicated, which I guess is good for me, but I honestly, I think it would be better for the industry as a whole if they didn't make it so complicated.
And I think it's also a reflection, not just like tax numbers, but on the like the unjust side of the history continues in the present, and that a lot of the folks who have been growing, been selling, been buying, have not, given legislation and sort of culture and access to capital, a lot of other things, been brought with this new fully rec market. And so it's disappointing all around. And I do think it starts with the laws, but those of us operating also trying to do what we can until equity licensing and legislation sort of becomes more equitable.
No, absolutely. I was actually going to ask next about equity because, Michael and Maggie, you guys seem to have some experience with that. And for the past, 20 plus years with the medical market, there was no talk of equity. We can say the same here in Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York. I think New Jersey is probably one of the first states that has a medical program, and now they're looking at, equity provisions. So why is there a gap? Why does it have to be triggered at adult use and not looking at disparities when it's the same plant, it's grown the same, but because it's patients, right? But why is that? Why does it have to be triggered with adult use in terms of equity? It's a weighty question.
Maggie, do you want to take the first jab at this?
So many philosophical points of view. Even I think it's a false dichotomy of adults and medical, but that's a whole other thing. We say out here all use is medical, but I do also believe in kind of, as you guys touched on more specific research and systems for patients. But I think it's folks demanding it, and I think why we obviously have to continue to do that now with sort of legalization and full rec coming into a little bit more of a spotlight, and then of course the capital investors and the attention that come along with that. Folks have rightfully, groups here in California, Supernova Women, have been working on this for 5+ years on really infusing social equity into the laws. And of course, we've got a long way to go, but I think it's the increased attention is a huge part of it.
Great.
I mean, my take on why social equity is being attached to adult use, I think, is probably because that's where the biggest influx of money is coming from. And so cities and states, I think, see it as an opportunity to fund their programs because just the volume of investment is so much higher, the interest is so much higher from speculators that I think they see it as an easier sell to sort of get into the game. You have to fund these social equity endeavors. I mean, I'm not a I'm not a legislator, so I'm sort of speculating, but having sat through enough city council meetings and committee meetings and stuff like that, I think that's their thinking. And if they're going to give the opportunity to people with money, they're going to have some asks for that to fund their programs.
So do you guys think it's right? I mean, is there a trigger point? Does it have to be adult? Should we look at a model like Massachusetts or New Jersey and say, hey, if you have a medical program, there should be more equity in it? Or, I guess where does equity get triggered? Is it when we depenalize? Is it medical markets? Is it adult markets? That's the question.
Yesterday, I mean, I think it's 2020, and this strange state by state rollout of some kind of cannabis legislation has us in different phases. But I think now, we're way behind, especially, and I think for any category or plan or industry, especially given the history of cannabis and the criminalization and how many hundreds and thousands, mostly of Black and brown men, sit in jail, while we have the privilege of now making careers and profiting off of the same plant. I think it needs to be infused in, and 10x what it currently is, in any laws that are being written, regardless of that sort of medical, non-medical.
No, that's a great point. So I want to go to Abby, because Abby, she worked for a big dog for a bit, and here in Mass we have what's considered positive impact plans, and it's basically every company that holds a license has an obligation to do something to give back to these communities that have been harmed. So curious to know, is that similar there on the West? And then also, is it the responsibility of private companies? Like, Abby, you work for Medicinal, one of the biggest companies out there. What did they do for these communities that have been harmed?
So that was actually, there was a team there that focused on things like this, and we would, donate money to different various causes for the expungement of records and things like that. So, I think there's definitely an opportunity for a lot of companies to do more. And, I think it's not mandated by any means that that's something people have to do. But I think, the brands and companies that are kind of thoughtful about it and aware of it are investing their money in that way. Another tactic I've seen from some of the bigger players is also investing in lobbying and, for specific regulations, or making things a little less strict for all of us so we can do business a little easier. But those are two kind of tactics I have seen implemented more so by the bigger players, I'd say, just because they have the funds and resources to do so. But, I think companies do recognize kind of where we came from.
No, it's a great point. And I know, Maggie, you had talked a little bit about your company being involved with that. So I was hoping you can touch a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I am a believer in there are definitely amazing kind of advocacy groups led by people of color, like I mentioned, Supernova Women here in California, and others nationally who have been doing this work for a long time. So I think the first step is supporting the existing work and following the leaders. They tend to focus a lot on policy and legislation, and something I've been working on with a bunch of other companies the past few months is how do we do right? I do think it's on us as the legal industry to help not only repair harms caused by the war on drugs, especially in the communities where we're operating and profiting, trying to profit. And what can we do now? And so something at Besito, we think it's about hiring first and foremost and being about it on the inside. It's about supply chain and who you partner with and vendors. And I really believe you can bring anti-racism work to business decisions you make every day. It's not like some big moment to be anti-racist. It's about who you show, and our creative. We've been very mindful about representing who our communities and who we know loves this plant, and then absolutely doing what you can. So things like sales campaigns, we've always done 1% of all of our sales to nonprofits focused on this work. So that's how I think about it for my startup. And now we've been working on a coalition of companies who are doing that, pretty much focused on hiring and company culture, amplification, and just sharing the voices of folks doing this work. And then the financial component, either monthly donations, percent of sales, but it is on us to come together and maximize impact in that way. But we have the Black folks who are leading this work in this coalition in particular. So it's still quite early, I think, and we have great leaders, and it's about kind of connecting the dots and communicating better. But I see more and more of that intention, which is the first step. And so I do believe that, the private companies, we need to do what we can immediately.
Right. And I get what you mean about like being present now and like more or less not being a campaign because of what's going on with obviously George Floyd and many talks of the defund the police. So it's not a fad. It's something that obviously needed to happen yesterday in cannabis, and now it's kind of a parallel track to what's going on across the nation. So I think it's a very interesting time for all of us to kind of be in this space right now.
Absolutely. The long-term commitment, and it's also, of course, about accountability and like getting real numbers and following up and keeping people accountable and avoiding absolutely any, like right now we're seeing 2 months ago in particular after the murder of George Floyd, the sort of rush of performance activism and making sure folks are committed and being about it on the back end for the long term versus sort of, I'll say, the brand and the benefits to the brand, which is obviously not the point.
Absolutely. Love to hear your take on it, Mike. Just who's responsible for the cleaning up the disparities? What could companies be doing? Mike, you there?
Sorry, I lost internet.
So did you get that last question?
Sorry, no, I didn't. I just I missed all of it.
No doubt. Yeah, I was just curious on your perspective on like the disparities that exist now. Who's more or less responsible? Is the government agency that's regulating cannabis? Is it the individual businesses? Kind of as I mentioned before, here in Mass, we have what's called the Positive Impact Plan, where every company has to have a plan for it. It sounds like that's not the case in California.
So it varies city by city. So on a lot of cities will make you enter into what's called a community benefits agreement or some kind of agreement like that. not necessarily touching on social equity, but just sort of it spells out what the city is going to get in return for giving you a license to operate.
Yeah.
Sometimes that hits social equity notes, but more it's about what the city can extract from the business in terms of financial contributions. I would say, I mean, the who's responsible for the disparate outcomes that social equity is aimed to correct is a very, I think, a complicated answer, because, I mean, ultimately the police, legislators, those are the people who have created the laws and enforce the laws in this disparate way that results in these outcomes, these life outcomes that are so different among races and socioeconomic classes. But I think, I mean, as a sort of baseline step, I think from a legal standpoint, I think just universal expungements of cannabis crimes is sort of like the first step in correcting that. And then, I mean, we've sort of treated very, I think, simply what social equity is meant to meet, like what implementation of it, at least in LA, which I can speak to because I've worked mostly here, where it means social equity equals ownership of these businesses. These are the only licenses we're going to grant. But what that has sort of resulted in is a lot of shotgun marriages between social equity qualifying candidates and the private equity world. And I would say by and large, those relationships have not gone well. And that's, I think, because the city has tried to reduce a very complicated problem and solution to something just so narrow, which doesn't really address in my mind, what is the underlying problem, which is like the socioeconomic differences that are not being changed just by cannabis. I mean, that requires a whole educational infrastructure overhaul that just these cannabis equity programs, I think, are too narrow to really address. So I just feel like it's the right spirit. Implementation has just been bungled virtually everywhere I look. I would say maybe with the exception of Illinois, which I did have some experience dealing with, because the state is going in and they'll be your financial partner. And I feel like that's really the way, if the state wants, or, if the government, the state wants to fix these things, really they have to step up and they have to be the partner for these businesses in a way that just private industry is not going to do, because, sophisticated financial investment is not going to put the kind of deal together that the city or state really needs for its social equity program to be what it intends to be. And I think it's impossible to really make those private businesses sort of, in my mind, make up for the harm that the state has really caused. And so I would like to see sort of more of a global look at this problem, not just so narrowly through social equity and what private businesses can do, for a one-to-one sort of exchange in creating social equity benefits. I think I digressed immensely from the initial question.
That was perfect.
But that's my take on sort of the social equity stuff that I've experienced.
Yeah, so there's two things there. One, you had mentioned what we consider HCAs, which is host community agreements. You guys call them benefits or whatever, that you had mentioned. Is the one-to-one part of the social equity? And then for in LA right now, is it looking at one-to-one model?
So it's actually a 2-to-1. The current framework, well, I should step back. Originally, it was proposed for retail businesses that it would be a 2-to-1 ratio, social equity businesses, 2 for every 1 non-social equity.
Right.
But the starting place was not 0, because there had already been 186 licensed non-social equity businesses, which are part of the legacy operators, we call them, that have existed in LA for a number of years. So we were going to start off then with 2 times 186. I'm a lawyer, so my math is terrible, but but nearly another 400 licenses would have to get granted to achieve that ratio that the city desired. Since then, they have basically done the math and said, well, the only new businesses we're going to license are going to be social equity. So they've sort of made that more of a bright line. Because there's a cap based on population in the city of LA, how many businesses there can be, but they're basically saying all of the new ones are going to be social equity owned.
That's amazing. So just going back to the benefit that you had mentioned, I'm sorry, what's the term that you guys go by there?
So, cities call them community benefits agreements. And that is a contract. It's literally a contract between the business and the city itself that, you're going to do X or pay X in exchange for these, the right to do this. They usually have terms, long terms that then get renewed by the city council. But that's sort of a separate piece from the city of LA is not taking that approach. They are doing, they are making their framework through the partnership itself is owned by a social equity qualifying partner. And then they have some strings attached on what those businesses have to do to be, local hiring certain types of employees that are either from low-income areas or have other qualifying, single parent, formerly homeless, veterans, that kind of stuff, to sort of ensure that there's a trickle down of the benefit.
Gotcha. So that is, you're starting to see some equity language in the benefit agreements, which it seems like you had just mentioned that. What about, is it a requirement for all businesses or just in some areas? I think you had mentioned that too. It's just in some parts of LA, some counties, like, because here in Mass it's required for every municipality. Everyone has to have an HCA, is what we call it.
The state does not have a universal requirement like that. They have incentivized local governments to implement policies by having grant money that's awarded to them. Like the city of LA got, I don't know, something like $1.4 billion or something for its program. So the state incentivizes it, but is sort of letting the local, and that's sort of a lot of the state's approach to its licensing is local control based.
Right. So I'll tell you, with the HCAs, kind of those host agreements being a requirement, what we have seen a lot is these big players, these multi-state operators come in and they enter into this pay-to-play model. So because it's a requirement, they can offer more benefits, if you will, to those municipalities. Is there anything similar to that, even though it's not a requirement for all companies to have a benefit agreement, but your big boys, going back to Abby, the Medmans of the world, the bigger companies, multi-state operators, they have more access to capital, so how are they able to open up faster, and in what form? Is there, kind of the relationship if there's not a benefit agreement? Abby, Maggie, Mike, what do you guys?
I can hear you.
Yeah. All right, cool.
I guess just one thing I want to maybe touch on or kind of tee up MJ to talk more about. I think the challenge in LA, at least, is that the cost required to open a dispensary is so extremely high that, from what I've seen, a lot of like the equity candidates, and I don't know if this is a requirement or just what has to happen so that they're able to do this, so MJ can speak more to that, but the equity candidates partner with some sort of, a private equity or some other sort of investment injection of capital to be able to operate. I don't know, MJ, if that's like a requirement or if that's just kind of how things have happened because those social equity candidates need more financial support.
Well, in LA, that was a function of a very silly requirement the city made of you needing to have your real estate under lease or under contract to buy just to apply. LA is one of the most expensive commercial real estate markets in the country. As soon as a landlord figures out that or because you need to tell the landlord you need their permission to do cannabis activity, the landlord figures out you're doing cannabis and your rent just tripled. Yeah. That's the kind of negotiating process that was going on around the time of like this latest round of social equity licensing for retail. It was bananas, to put it kindly. But that would make it impossible for any you had to have, not millions of dollars, but certainly $1 million, and to even just qualify to submit an application. And for a program that was designed to, by definition, help low-income people, what low-income person would qualify to submit an application then when they had to lock up a piece of real estate that was going to cost them 10 grand a month potentially? And we waited, I believe we submitted September 2nd of 2019, 5 applications. None of those is operational currently. So you would basically be sitting on a lease for that long, having to pay without being able to do anything with the property. It's just, it was sort of an utter catastrophe and a failure on the city's part, in my opinion.
And setups like that, and I totally agree. It's like, yeah, by definition, this isn't going to work. We've seen a lot of predatory practices, which you alluded to, Michael, of folks sort of with capital injecting themselves and having social equity licensees or applicants, signing things that they might not know what's going on, and things are changing and quickly and whatnot, and giving up the entire equity, or most of the equity, which is the entire point. So I think as far explicitly, we've got a whole mess on the equity side that has not been solved. And then even sort of beyond equity licensing, even if it's not as explicit, I think like everything is a bit pay to play, right? It's like, and that's an entire barrier to people of color as well, which is to get a license, to get shelf space, just to like stay in right now is very capital intensive, and in California, which is super competitive.
So would you say that some of the bigger companies, with access to capital, for obvious reasons, they, could hold on to a lease or buy a property and just kind of know how to play that game? Which I think you think about pricing, how are you going to compete with those guys, right? Do you guys see those disparities now? Like you go to a bigger shop and they probably have more product, they have more lower pricing, things of that nature.
100%.
Yeah. Is that what you deal with right now, Maggie? Because you have a product.
But they tend to have higher prices, not lower prices. But
Okay. Well, that leads to another question, like just in terms of trends. Because I have a partner of mine who's out there. He has a product called El Blunto. They do pretty well in some of the.
Mm-hmm.
You guys familiar?
Yeah.
Ty's my dude. He'll probably be here tomorrow. But he does well. A little bit of a vertical kind of merge because he does grow some of his product too. And I know he got through licensing. It was a little tricky, but he ended up getting through it. So like, what kind of trends do you guys see in the market? Are people shying away from the big money vendors because they know that they're not good people? I would like to think that consumers are informed enough to make those right decisions, but right? So what kind of trends do you guys see that are in relation to equity in the smaller mom and pops?
Well, I'd like to think that, MedMen's definitely gotten its share of bad press over all time. But I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I haven't been there in a while, so I don't know how business is going for them. It seems to be pretty steady from what I see. And I think, they were kind of first to market in the rec market. And so I think it's the one that everyone really recognizes and knows. So they've been able to really sustain themselves. But I think I think as with every industry, we'll start to see people want to vote with their dollars and really spend money with the brands and the stores that kind of align with their values. And, from a marketing standpoint, in working with influencers and things like that, I have seen influencers not willing to work with brands or dispensaries that aren't speaking out on equity and, issues that matter to them. And so, I think as, a society, we'll start to really see those trends start to take shape. I'd say the biggest trend in the legal market is really just pricing. I think because the products are so heavily taxed, there are a lot of people that are just very price sensitive because cannabis can become a very expensive habit for you pretty quickly when you're someone who, goes in once a week, spends $100. So I think there are a lot of deal seekers. The market is largely made up of those core people who shop regularly, and the people who are kind of, canna curious, as we call them, are definitely a smaller percentage and maybe not comfortable going to dispensaries yet, and, shop once every 4 months, 6 months, things like that. So they're not going to be like the core business. And then I think delivery obviously, is gaining traction, especially with the whole COVID lockdown situation. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
That's great.
I was thinking those two as well. And unfortunately, I think they're a bit at odds in that, like, the smaller group of folks who are pushing for sort of conscious consumerism, and there's an awesome list called Inclusive Base, run by Cannaclusive and Almost Consulting. That's Black, brown, queer owned businesses to support, to partner with, etc. You have that group. It is smaller. Hopefully it's growing. And then on the flip side, the biggest trend, I agree with you, Abby, is pricing. The trend is that people are very price sensitive in cannabis, and I have a lot of theories why. But of course, a lot of the bigger players, for a variety of reasons, but it comes back to money in one way or the other, vertical integration, buying power, they can often price less. And so unfortunately, I think those are at a bit of odds right now. But I think, again, we're very early, and there's also just so many brands coming in all the time, and also brands coming out. And so I think building brand loyalty is a bit difficult in these earliest days, but I do believe, especially, there's I think an ethos and overlap in folks who want to consume cannabis and hopefully also care about the history of the plant and the folks creating the ecosystem around it.
Great point. Just going back to what Abby had mentioned, and Mike, you might be familiar with this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Massachusetts, but just with the delivery trend, I find it funny that, like, delivery is definitely more traditional. I know you guys are talking about 90% of the market in Massachusetts and Connecticut and California is unregulated, under the table, but, like, I mean, we've all been in the situation where we got our weed dude delivered. So it's baffling that, like, these states don't think about that, like, first of mind, But here in Massachusetts, the delivery is exclusive. The delivery and social consumption is exclusive for equity for X amount of time. Right now, they say 2 years. That might get extended just because, things aren't going as planned, and there might be a longer time. So how are delivery licenses out in California, one, and then two, are there exclusive periods? Are there exclusivity to any licensing at all for equity? Like, how does that kind of factor in? And do you guys think that's a good idea, for Massachusetts to do that?
I think it depends. I mean, in California, the regulations around delivery are so complex that you, again, need significant capital to make it work. You know, and I don't know if this is still the case, but I know at one point you had to actually like own the cars. All the employees had to be W-2'd. You had to have at least, you know, a certain number of people in the car. You can only carry a certain amount of product. So the car has to go back to the dispensary and reload. So, I mean, it's definitely, but it's not, here it's not like it is in Massachusetts where it's awarded only to specific types of licensees. It's, I mean, I think you apply, and MJ can correct me if I'm wrong, but you apply the same way you would apply for a dispensary license, a retail license.
So my take on, well, the city of LA has put in some, and actually I have to look at this to be sure, but I'm pretty sure the Type 9 delivery only licenses are tied to social equity, at least for some amount of time. So I think they are taking a similar approach here. But I mean, I really think, you know, these things that are designed to give like first mover advantage to social equity. I mean, at this point in California, the cat's out of the bag. I mean, there's like, you know, if you're licensed now, you're still competing against, I mean, for instance, in LA, you have at least 186 other businesses that already exist that have also been around for potentially 10 years. And so, you know, I think that's unfortunately sort of lip service to the real underlying thing that these businesses need to really launch, which is like someone to walk them through how complicated it is to get operating and how expensive it is. And unfortunately, I think that the city just has to step up and take that, and they have to be more of a guide than a hurdle to these entrepreneurs.
No, it's great. And you mentioned, was it tier 9? What's the?
So yeah, it's called a Type 9 in California, which is just for delivery.
Gotcha. Now, what about social consumption? How is that looking out in California for you guys?
Someday.
Wow.
Well, West Hollywood issued some social consumption lounges, or licenses. But I think only one so far has been able to open.
Just Lowell's, right?
Yeah, because I'm in touch with someone who has been awarded one of the other ones, and the amount of hoops they've had to jump through, and like they just haven't been able to open.
We had one for a few months last year.
What happened?
I do not know. I've heard a few things, but it was the Lowell's. Then they rebranded to the Cannabis Cafe, and then I think around COVID, maybe they haven't reopened after everything shut down, or maybe it was before. But we had a taste of it, and I know in SF, I think they've got some in the desert as well. But I think it's like so many things, the very beginning, I'm such a believer in like on premise and the future of consumption. And yeah, we had that taste, which was fascinating to walk into that cafe. I don't know if you guys got to go last year, but it's like, oh my gosh, people are just like dabbing and eating their burger, and like it's like mind blowing to see people smoking joints legally over food. And
I was going to ask, because here in Massachusetts, you're not allowed to smoke joints or blunts inside. That's ridiculous. So people are like, what's the point of this whole, because the edible is going to take a little while to kick in. So like, what? Now you want them driving? So you were able to smoke joints and blunts inside?
Totally. It was like an indoor-outdoor situation, but yes, it was. And even then, and I love cannabis, I was sort of strange, like eating and the smoke in your face too. So it's very early. I'm excited to see where that goes, because I also think that's a big part of how we destigmatize and bring the plant more mainstream, and with all the other education we have to do on the plant and the truth, given 100 years of government propaganda. I think experiencing it and creating comfortable spaces that aren't just bars where it's like, okay, booze is the leading drug and what's the social experience around that, but it's a different plant and effect and experience, and really creating the space to bring people in, I think is really exciting.
It sounds like you got plans on social consumption.
I got a lot of ideas.
Yeah,
And no licenses.
let me get an invite on the opening day. That's awesome. It made me think.
Besito Consumption Lounge.
Yeah, no, it's got a ring to it.
My experience with consumption, I mean, I know of the places in California where they have licensed them, but the only time I've ever, and I'll admit, I am not an avid consumer, which is strange that I'm in this industry, but when I was 18, I went to Amsterdam, and that was sort of like that was the most sort of open use that you could definitely do at this time. It was probably 2002. So, I mean, unfortunately, that's what I would love to see social consumption look like. You walk into a coffee shop, you pick you would point at a flower and the bartender would roll you a joint. And that I'm nearly certain will not happen for probably 10 years in California. I mean, it's just, even I think at Lowell's, you go there, the food can't come out of the same, because of the rules that exist. I mean, they have all these sort of ridiculous things, like you have a cafe next door that's bringing you the food where you're sitting and consuming, because the health department laws don't allow you to have smoking in a food establishment. So you end up with these sort of like very bizarre iterations of plans that you submit to like the local city officials to get around sort of, in my mind, silly prohibitions that exist for this kind of stuff. Because we would never say, oh, you're serving alcohol, you can't serve food. And in fact, we require a lot of types of alcohol licenses that you do sell food, and that at least 51% of your register receipts are food, depending on the type of alcohol license it is. So, we need to get to a place where cannabis is regulated at least equal to alcohol, if not less, at least based on what I think are the negative consequences from it.
That would be such a huge jump from where we are now.
It would be an enormous jump.
That all the time in building this industry, and I sort of used the word drug tongue in cheek earlier, but in building this industry and being an advocate for it as we are every day, and coming up with all the barriers and prohibitions against it, and then knowing our former worlds and CPGs and the way alcohol, I think in particular, is a linchpin of our society. And as far as brand and media, big alc is a beast. And so, yes, then to think about us, and I can't buy a Facebook ad, like we got a long way to go in that, in those critical kind of enablers of an industry.
Right.
I know, and it's like when you think about like pharmaceutical too, all the research about cannabis is how it can sort of be an alternative to opioids and things like that. And the fact that it's like so much more regulated than, some of these other industries, it's just kind of mind blowing. But yeah, I mean, that was another really big motivator for me getting into the industry, is just that, destigmatizing it, like you said, Maggie, and getting more people to experience something that isn't going to have the like detrimental effects that overuse of alcohol or a certain part of pharmaceuticals can have, that just like wreck your insides. And who knows, maybe cannabis has some long-term effects that we haven't researched yet, but so far I don't think we've seen too many.
We're all still here.
Right.
No, it's not poison.
Yeah,
right.
So,
not literal poison.
not literal poison. Alcohol kills 3 million people a year.
Wow.
And as we know, there are no fatal cannabis overdoses.
So just going back to a point that Abby had made, and the thought that came back, this two-part question. Do you guys see any like rehabilitation centers that work with cannabis? And then also we had talked about the underground market, being 90%, 80, 90%. Do you see that for social consumption too? So are there spots right now that are not licensed? Because I asked that because there's a spot like a half a mile down the road from this establishment here where the guy, he got through zoning and the city's okay with it. And it's a social consumption lounge, but he's like, I'm not messing with the state license because it's just a mess. So just curious on that from your guys' perspective.
So on the rehab or medical front, like licensed doctors are not allowed to recommend cannabis products because they're not like FDA approved and like go through all of those regulations and everything. Maybe it's not FDA the right thing, but they're not like federally regulated. So I know doctors cannot recommend. In regards to underground consumption lounges, I mean, I know there are like privately owned, and I don't want to blow up anyone's spot because, we're all trying out here, but marketing regulations are extremely strict. And I know that there are kind of like, underground parties or lounges or things like that are privately owned and like private property.
Right.
So I know that takes place and definitely probably doesn't adhere to the regulations, but there's nothing that I'm personally aware of that's like a public space that, I mean, they would get shut down so fast, I feel like, but maybe you guys know otherwise.
Yeah.
One of the most common questions I get from clients is, I want to throw a brand launch party. We're going to be consuming. How do I do this legally? And there is something in California called there's a temporary cannabis event. There are, actually, I don't even know of a licensed event that's taken place this year. I mean, I imagine COVID's going to knock that out for the rest of the year. But they are very difficult because you also need you need the similar version of a local permit to do that. And very few places, I can maybe like 3 I can think of even have something like that. And so for all purposes, they don't exist. And a permitted consumption event, but they exist everywhere. I mean, any number of private parties have these things going on, and it's one of the more common things. And it basically comes down to the people's risk tolerance, because the likelihood of the BCC, which is the state agency that would knock on your door, discovering this or even enforcing it if they found out about it, I think is so remote. Most people are just they get the necessary insurance in place, because you can get insurance for these events even though they aren't permitted, and they just say, we'll roll the dice. So far I haven't heard of a party getting busted.
Right.
Exactly.
Great.
And Ulysses, I think like the rehab question is a great one. It's actually something I was reading a thread on last night. There aren't programs I know of. I think, as we've been talking about, we are working so hard to like set the record straight on cannabis, talk about the benefits, which I am a huge advocate of, but I also think we need to talk about the cons as we know them, and honestly as we don't know them. We need research, robust research on this plant for all kinds of therapies. Anyways, I think that is a big opportunity as we increase access to cannabis and educate accordingly. Talking about, even if it's, we know it's not sort of as physically addictive as alcohol or other drugs, but there is still a buzz there, and it can be a compulsion factor. And I think that's an important, that type of responsibility with cannabis is a big opportunity. And I think, like many things, it's on us to do everything we can with what we have now as operators in the industry.
Right.
Ulysses, was your question using cannabis in rehab as an alternative to? Okay.
Yeah.
But one thing I just want to clarify there is, like, in a lot of medical states, the dispensaries are run by pharmacists. And so of course, they can recommend cannabis and have to go through certain, programs and training to be able to do so. But like a regular doctor at Cedars-Sinai is not allowed to recommend cannabis, is what I meant by that.
No, I got you. But yeah, it was
today.
specifically to your point, Abby, about the rehabs and basically being beneficial for people who are in those positions and I know them. I know kids that I grew up with that played sports and got addicted to pills because they got injured or whatever it may be. And cannabis helps. So I know there isn't anything out here where a rehab facility is, advocating cannabis, and I was just curious if there's something.
So I'm aware of private, like facilities, like physical therapy type places that use hemp CBD products as part of and like massage, parlors and things like that. Like have an add-on where you can get like a CBD rub or something like that.
Right.
Based. But that's kind of the most that I have seen. I mean, when you look at sports, I know there have been I think there's been some relaxation in regulations in regards to certain sports in terms of like testing positive for marijuana. But for a long time, that was not an option. And I know a lot of athletes who were in, that I've heard their stories or spoken with them, and they've gone through immense pain, and they'd actually plan like their cannabis consumption around when like the season and when they knew they were going to be tested and things like that, because they were just tired of getting pumped with pain pills all the time. And how those pills would like change their whole demeanor and affect with their family when they weren't on the field and things like that. So, I mean, we definitely have a long way to go. But, seems like progress is being made. There's a ton of research coming out of Israel on the medical benefits of cannabis. They're definitely light years ahead of anyone else. So, hopefully we can all start to benefit from some of that here.
Yeah, unfortunately, even with all the progress that states may make with regulating cannabis or legalizing it and regulating it, it's still a Schedule I drug, and the federal government is, under this administration, certainly not going to change that. Maybe there's an opportunity, in 2021 with a new administration and a Democratic Congress that I think has a good chance of changing the federal legal status. And that's really standing in the way of a lot of research. The reasons that doctors can't prescribe marijuana or cannabis is because of the federal status of it. Mm-hmm. So they're relegated to, in California, you get these like paper recommendations that say like, oh, recommended for, anxiety. But that's really, sort of a preposterous thing when you're talking about something that potentially has medical benefits that we need to study. So, hopefully that changes, and then we can see sort of a mainstream use for medical. Sure, it obviously it's a fun product for people to use, but it also, it potentially has very meaningful medical applications that our heads are in the sand because we're not allowed to study it, or very few institutions are allowed to study it. The University of Mississippi was the only educational institution allowed to study this thing for decades.
And they're trapped. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, it's a bunch of scientists from Mississippi growing cannabis. No, they're probably from elsewhere too. But yeah, really and this has been, the DEA has been dragging their feet on issuing any new permissions to bona fide research facilities that are going to do the science that we need to really understand the plant. Because otherwise Israel fortunately has been sort of spearheading this. Israel has they had the first known study, I think, in the 80s on this. So it's not like, we are just allowing it to, and Europe is also picking up speed in terms of their research. and we're just going to be, sitting here twiddling our thumbs, deciding whether or not to reschedule it. I think it's just ludicrous.
I love the question. When is it going to get rescheduled? When is it going to be federally legal? I feel like it's been 5 years for the past 50 years. People say 5 years, but what are your guys' opinion on when we'll see that declassified?
It has sped up for me. We're seeing it become more and more of a bipartisan issue.
Abby, you have a prediction on that?
Gosh, I used to feel more strongly about it happening sooner, and now I feel like I'd say like 3 to 5 years.
Wow. So you think the next administration possibly, or right after?
I don't know. I just feel like it felt really close for a minute, and then I feel like it's been pushed back for me. So I don't know. MJ.
Was that on the eve of 2016? It felt really close.
Yeah, it's like honestly before rec is when it felt closer to me. And now that I've seen how the rec market has kind of panned out, it just feels further away now.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think when, and it's not a question of if, it's when the federal government does change its stance, we're going to get an exciting new excise tax from the feds on it. Because of course the carrot that the industry will use, or their lobbyists use, is that, here's a new source of revenue. I think actually COVID may expedite that, because what we're going to see, the long-term economic and sort of ripple effect from this, is going to be a dramatic reduction in all sorts of revenue streams that the feds, the states, and the local governments are used to seeing. And I think even for local cities in California that are still, a majority of local municipalities in California still ban cannabis businesses, which is an important thing actually to note. The state law gives local control to cities and counties to regulate, which includes completely prohibiting these businesses.
Gotcha.
And
real quick,
by land. Yeah.
When you say the majority of cities and towns and municipalities, are you talking about during COVID, or they just have a moratorium on the
period?
Period.
Just aside from COVID, if you looked at a map of California and you had green zones versus red zones where it's banned, it's like 75% of the area of the state is, you're actually not allowed to open one of these businesses. There's currently even a lawsuit pending between a lot of those cities and counties and business and the Bureau of Cannabis Control, which is the state regulatory authority for retail delivery businesses and distributors and storefront retailers.
Right.
Basically, because the state agency said, if you're a delivery business, you can deliver to anywhere in the state.
Right.
These cities said, no. This bill was specifically passed, so we had local control to ban it.
Yeah.
So there's a lawsuit that's been pending. There was a hearing set in July. I think that has been continued because of the COVID stuff. Courts are sort of slow to hear stuff. They're doing Zoom, but it's still, even within California, which is this cannabis-centric culture that we talked about before. There's a lot of the state that is like Mississippi, or any number of places that are going to be like number 49 and 50 to legalize marijuana in the country. So even though mainstream culture and the populous, San Francisco, San Diego, LA, virtually the whole coast has some form of regulations, and even if you go inland to the desert, there are still a majority of places that don't. So I think that's an important thing to actually just say, that even here, where we even have some controversial places to go. And I forget why I got sidetracked on that, but there was that was part of another. Oh well, it's gone.
Well, no. Well, we were talking about legalization on the federal level, and I never knew 70%. That's a massive. To me, that's just like opportunity, right? And we talk about the culture being so strong in California, yet there's still this huge gap that exists. that's
Yeah, I guess you should actually, when you slice this up, you should put that discussion with the California culture, because I think it is an important caveat to what everybody thinks is like, California free love and grass or whatever. There's this whole other side of us that is like very conservative.
Well, and a lot of people here actually do not want legalization nationally because they've been, that kind of having it be so hard and limited limits how many people can take advantage of it. And when you open it up to everyone gets a much smaller slice of that pie. So there are a lot of people who actually have been in the industry for a long time and are not supportive of legalization. So, from my perspective as a marketer and, like with working with brands, if it could just be reduced from being a Schedule I drug and we could be able to run a Facebook ad, as you said, Maggie, like things like that would just make it so much easier to build a brand and sell products. So that would be progress enough for me at this point.
I saw a bumper sticker this week. It was, I guess, re-legalize cannabis.
Re-legalize.
I'm messing up, but yeah, basically with what you're saying, I was like, oh my God. I mean, it's been messy, and that's a reflection.
Wow, absolutely. So I want to ask you guys another question, just kind of on the tip of federal legalization, but we had talked about all of us being from the East. Mike, PA, Maggie and I, Connecticut, Abby, Rhode Island. So all those states have medical markets, as well as New York, New Jersey. And in this program for Clark, there are a lot of municipal leaders. In the last class that I taught, I had a chief of police in my class, a lot of state legislative people. So these are folks that are, well into their career and are really looking at like how to make this cannabis regulation thing work. So for people in states that do have medical markets, like where we're from, and they're transferring over to adult markets, what one piece of advice, 1, 2, 3 things, piece of advice should you give to them, or should they have top of mind when it comes to adult legalization or, a recreational market at a local level and then maybe at a state level as well? It's a weighty question.
I mean, I think, I don't know if this would be as much of an issue in some of those states because I don't know how persistent the black market is really there, but I just feel like the taxation has been a real hindrance here. So if there's any, and I know it's exciting for the cities and states to get all that revenue, and that's a big motivator, but if there's some way to not have that be such a large part, like I don't know how it is in Massachusetts right now, but in LA, like your taxes are like 35% on top of the price of the product. So, if you're buying, $70 worth of product, you're walking out spending over $100. So it's pretty significant. And just, one complaint I've heard about the medical markets over there is just kind of a lack of good products and lack of knowledgeable bud tenders or sales associates. I don't know what they're called there, or prescribing pharmacists or whatever they're called. I've heard of people going in for medical conditions, since that's what's available right now in those states, and the person not being able to recommend anything for them, not being very knowledgeable. That's something that I know California dispensaries spend a lot of time educating their bud tenders and sales associates to be able to recommend products. So I think that's just kind of more of a, customer experience thing that could be improved.
That's great. Thank you. Maggie?
I think similarly, like implementing legislation with a bit of humanity. Obviously, first and foremost, building this equitable industry, not having ridiculous requirements and red tape in order to do that, but being realistic about how we bring people of color, many who know more about this plant than anyone else, into the legal side. And then similarly, being human and realistic about consumers and taxing, for example. Like, this isn't a new thing. probably $60 billion unregulated industry, and to be realistic about bringing people and consumers, operators, if you're, that's the situation here. You're going to pay 40% tax at this shop, or just go here where you've been going, and a little more reason of what the alternative is for folks, especially in cannabis.
That's great. Thank you. What about you, Mike?
I would love to speak directly to these municipal leaders. I think there's a couple things that that they should keep in mind. One, the tax revenue is never what there's always this pie in the sky sort of view of it, and I don't think you should look at the economic benefit through just a lens of what is the tax revenue this municipality is going to receive, because I mean, now we're looking at, who knows what the next unemployment numbers are going to be, but we're looking at a lot of sectors that are basically shut out because their type of business it violates all of the safety precautions that the COVID epidemic requires. And so I would look at this as, here is an essential business that can stay open through this kind of pandemic. It creates jobs, and a spectrum of jobs, from ones that are entry level to sophisticated, high paying jobs. There's taxes that come out of payroll taxes for that. It's not just, taxes on the transaction itself. So they should really look at the overall economic benefit that these businesses can bring, not just, okay, we're going to stick a 5% city business tax on it, which is going to actually really hamstring the businesses. But so I would look at it more, globally, what the economic benefit is. I would also say a lot of cities are always their first. When they're deciding, whether or not to regulate it and then how to regulate it, a lot of cities go hire a consultant to tell them what they should do. And I think that is the wrong approach, because one, I know these agencies, they hand cities the same cookie cutter things that they do for for any other place. So they're just like regurgitating something that they've already used. And really, I think when a city does this, they should set the priorities that they want to this program to bring. And that can be, social equity. That can be, restoring educational institutions. That can be any number of things. Like the priorities that the local community has, they should keep those in mind for this industry. And that's something that they have to do themselves. You can't pay a consultant to come out and tell you what's important for your city. Right. And then when it comes to actually regulating these businesses, cities already have the infrastructure and regulatory bodies to do this. They don't need to reinvent the wheel. They have a health department probably that inspects, food establishments. These are the same kinds of operations. They shouldn't look at cannabis like it needs this brand new, regulatory infrastructure. It can fit in to existing frameworks, and so that makes it a lot easier for businesses to start. And really, they should make these things non-discretionary entitlement processes that you would go through if you were opening a restaurant, or if you were opening a tomato farm, if you're growing. Like, there are other industries that you can look at. Granted, the security needs to be, that is a little different, but you have pharmacies probably in your city. These things are regulated like pharmacies. So there's, whether it's banks for the cash, like there are things that you can look to, right. So that, cities not starting from scratch. They already have all the pieces. They sort of just need to put them together. And so I think that's to really encourage in this industry in its infancy, which it still unfortunately is, because of the patchwork sort of startup that we've had. That's what I would encourage local leaders to do. And and I think that's the best, that will result in the best kinds of businesses.
Just
And
piggybacking on one point, how could I forget the banking regulations? If there's anyone that, if they can consider loosening that at all, that's been a huge hindrance, is just the cash only, or trying to find some, underground back end way to do debit cards or things like that. That would just make everyone's lives so much easier.
No, 100%. I think, it's important, thinking locally, especially here in Massachusetts. We've seen, to your point, Abby, and a little bit what Michael was saying, like we've seen banks here locally, like credit unions that have opened up to do business with cannabis, and they're local. They're community grown, And with your point, Michael, about like not reinventing the wheel, I could say from experience, like going through this and working with multiple municipalities, that is 100% true. Basically, it's good to get input and like build a team around it, but you don't necessarily need to start a whole new division. I think at the state level, it's a little bit different, but here in Worcester, where I'm at now, they did a really good job about collaborating with the police department, the fire department, the health department, and centralizing leaders from those departments and giving input on businesses that are opening up, in their municipality. So it's local is very important in cannabis. All right, cool, guys. So now what we got are some speed questions. This is a little bit more cultural. This is probably one of my favorite parts when I interview these folks, is to learn more about you guys as being participants, and again, gratefully to have you guys. So I want to start with the first question. What is your favorite marijuana movie, documentary? Basically on cannabis or drugs in general. Maggie looks like she's thinking, so we'll start with her.
I can go first if you need a minute.
I'm good. The most sort of formative one for me was Weedakit on Vice, like 5 years ago, when I was sort of switching from like, oh, I love weed, to like, oh, learning about all the applications and the endocannabinoid system and more medical things and cultural global history. And so that's a really nice kind of broad take on different corners of this plant.
That's cool. Very good. Thanks.
I was thinking a more like fun answer to this question, I guess, but I'd say my favorite weed movie is Half Baked.
Oh, me too.
Drug movie is Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
What is it? Fear and Loathing?
Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. If you guys have not seen that movie, it is hilarious. Not weed-related drugs, all the other related drugs.
Also a good book.
Nice. What about you, Mike?
So, let's see. One of my favorite high school movies was Dazed and Confused. I don't know if that's necessarily a weed movie. I feel like it is, but I don't know that there's any nexus between seeing that movie 100 times and where my career has landed me at this point. But who knows? Maybe it did have some influence on my formative years.
100 times, man. That's a lot. Oh, that's great.
I'd say I've started it 100 times. I probably haven't finished it.
So what about music with Maggie? What's influential music maybe steered you to the cannabis industry?
I don't know about that. I love a lot of music, and the first time I smoked weed was before an Oasis concert in Central Park, so there's a music tie there.
Okay. How old were you then? That's actually a question.
Like 15 or 16.
Okay, very nice. Oasis. Is that a band?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll check them out. What about you, Abby?
I've always been, growing up in Rhode Island, the hood of Rhode Island, always really been into hip hop, and I worked in hip hop right out of college. So, I guess there's sort of a tie there. The first time I smoked weed was at a high school graduation party. I was actually very like anti-weed in high school because I thought it was gonna, not make me, I was like top of my class and everything, and I thought it was gonna make me not smart or something. And then finally at a high school graduation party, I succumbed to peer pressure and smoked a joint after having consumed quite a bit of alcohol, which resulted in me feeling extremely sick.
Crossfaded.
So not a great first experience. Yes. Learned that term. So yeah, it's better.
That's better now. Mike, what about you?
So I'm going to say so in high school, I was definitely a bit of a hippie. I listened to a lot of Grateful Dead. I have seen Fish, I don't know how many times, a lot. I think the first time I ever used was at a Dave Matthews Band concert in circa 1999, probably.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely always been a classic rock sort of. That's been my genre. I do like 90s hip hop, anything DJ Premier produced, or I don't know. I have very music taste. I also listen to Bach when I'm doing work, so it's all over the place.
No, that's cool. That's very cool. So how about families? How do your families perceive your career in marijuana?
I had never spoken to my parents about cannabis, and I, started when I was 16, and then I told them, basically leaving business school, that I was going into the new cannabis industry, and they were certainly shocked and surprised. But now they've come around, and I think, we're seeing more and more, hopefully, acceptance all the time. But yeah, that was a shocker, I would say.
My parents were total hippies and think so they think it's cool, and they like to tell their friends that I'm like, pioneer in this industry out west.
Back home.
Yeah.
Great.
I mean, my dad went to Brown. Come on,
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, my parents are definitely old hippies. They met apple picking while they were backpacking in Washington State. So this was like not a surprise. Well, I guess it was less of a surprise, but they were like, they didn't even know that was a thing. I mean, I was like, I'm going to do, cannabis law. And they're like, well, we just thought that was a defense attorney. They're supportive. I really haven't met a lot of people who, I mean, I even talked to former police officers. I mean, I was just out in the desert talking to a guy who was an engineer. He was a retired cop. And he was like, yeah, I got a brother who's doing that too. It's like, I mean, it really is changing. Even the older generation. I mean, this guy was 65.
Right.
They're on board. I don't know what my grandparents would have said, but
yeah, and it's crazy because that's the generation, like our parents and even our grandparents, that they've been lied to the most. So try not to push it on them too much, but they ultimately love us. So
they can start with CBD. That seems to be the step one.
No, absolutely.
That's the gateway cannabinoid.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. So what about strains? Kind of talking about the CBD here. Favorite strain? If you were a strain of weed or type of weed, what would it be? It's probably a good question for Maggie, seeing that you have a product.
I've been growing Purple Gorilla for a few rounds now, and so that is my house strain, perfect for the my end of day on the porch.
That's awesome. Abby?
I admittedly don't consume a lot, and the products that I do consume are not strain specific, but for this one I'll go with Sunday Driver.
What is that? What kind of weed is that?
Means anything.
Sounds indica heavy.
Is it? Yeah. Yeah, that's true. What about you, Mike?
So I have to dig into the archives because I am also not really an avid
Mhm.
consumer anymore. But back when I was, my favorite strain was Jack Herrera. I'm going back. I mean, the first time I had it was 20 years ago. But that has always been my favorite.
You make
And
it
I
seem
know
like
it's
you're
one of
old.
the old ones.
Yeah,
What?
I said you make it seem like you're old, man.
No, just
Talk about
I'm trying to put
99.
I'm putting my consumption in way back in the history.
Right, man. No, that's great. That's great. All right, guys. Well, I certainly appreciate you guys joining, quite honestly. And Abby, again, you'll help to organize this. And part of this is a new industry, is also like new ways of getting educated. So just you guys having this experience and expertise in these areas, it means a lot. And yeah, I just want to thank you guys.
Thank you
Yeah, thanks
for
for having
having me.
us.
Absolutely. A lot of gratitude for Maggie, Abby, and Michael. A special thanks to Abby for connecting me with Michael and Maggie. And the beautiful thing about this interview was that they all have different backgrounds. Maggie is an entrepreneur. Abby is a marketer and has worked for one of the largest companies, cannabis companies in the space. And then Michael bringing his perspective and experience as a lawyer, more specifically working with social equity applicants within the city of Los Angeles and in the state of California. So I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and just comparing the differences from East to West Coast, and then to talk about how things can get better on the social equity front. So once again, big shout out to Abby for connecting us all. And I feel if you guys want to reach out to these folks, definitely feel free to find them on the web, on social medias, and connect with them. All right, thank you guys so much, and I hope you enjoyed this week.